This is a special edition of our portraits here at Planetary Calendar, especially for the Super Bowl in 2023, at which Rihanna is performing. And this was suggested by Lahni because she said, "Do we ever do a portrait of Rihanna?" And I said, "Of course we did." And she said, "Well, we should feature it as she comes up to her performance at the Super Bowl." So this is what we're doing. We're looking at the two charts, Rihanna's chart and the chart for the Super Bowl. Now, Rihanna is born February 20th, 1988. The Super Bowl, of course, is on February 12th, 2023. Now, on the Super Bowl, it's supposed to start at 3:30 p.m. The sun will be at 23 degrees Aquarius. It's pretty closely conjunct to Saturn at 27 degrees Aquarius, up there in the 8th house, powerhouse. The whole 10th house is filled up with Vesta, Jupiter in Aries, Martial energy at the midheaven, in fact, exactly at the midheaven, partile at 8 degrees, Chiron at 13 degrees Aries, and Juno at 15 degrees Aries, which is very interesting because the moon is also in a Mars-ruled sign, Scorpio, in the 5th house, the house of entertainment. So the moon, the crab, men in armored outfits, wearing armor, crushing into each other. And Mars is in the 12th house in Gemini. And this is where it gets kind of interesting, because the Mars is sextile to Chiron, right? Realize, as we're going into this, people have been sensitized to the injuries that football players sustain during these games. And there was the whole issue recently with the young football player in his early 20s who ran into another football player and had a heart attack. So people are very sensitized to this. So that Mars sextile to the Chiron about being wounded is very, very strong. Jupiter also relates very strongly to health. The injuries related to martial sports, and of course, what sport is more martial than football? Not many, not even boxing, I don't think. So you have this 8th house sun in Aquarius, the 5th house moon, and Cancer rising, which of course, Cancer in the United States makes perfect sense. Now, Rihanna is born in Pisces, and she's a 12th house native. So that's why make-believe works so well for her. And she has a bunch of stuff in Aries. Juno, the moon, Venus, the ascendant, and Jupiter in Aries. So Jupiter has gone back into the sign of her sun. So we're looking at the chart of the Super Bowl, and we're looking at the chart of Rihanna. For the Super Bowl chart, you have Aries highly elevated. So all of those planets that Rihanna has in Aries, Juno, the moon, Venus, and Jupiter, are highly elevated in this chart. The Super Bowl is lifting her up as a woman. The moon and Venus, the two most feminine planets, are both being lifted up high for this individual. No one's talked about anyone else really performing, or at least if they have, no one's noticed. And they're not talking about who's performing with her in terms of a group or band. No, it's all about Rihanna. And then Jupiter, of course, is up there as well. Remember, Jupiter also relates to people from foreign lands. And while football is the quintessential American sport, Rihanna was actually born in Barbados. She is, in fact, a foreigner. So it's fascinating. Meanwhile, this puts her sun up in the 9th house of the chart, highly elevated again. So much of her chart is elevated. So much of her major planets are being elevated in this chart, even to the extent that her Saturn is in the 7th house, right? The house of partnership, Saturn in Capricorn, and she has Saturn in Capricorn, a rulership position, a feminine position. That's what's so interesting about this. Remember, her sun is in a feminine sign. The two most feminine planets, the moon and Aries, are really being elevated. It's a deeply feminine chart. She has this deeply feminine chart, even though she has Aries rising. Because she has Venus, the moon, and Jupiter at the rising, she's this bigger than life personality. She's very entrepreneurial. Very, very entrepreneurial. This is a factor in her personality, but very creative. So she has this strong partnership energy going on. The Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pallas Athena, all in the 7th house of the Super Bowl chart. She was able to make a partnership with them. And now let's look at the chart from Rihanna's point of view. First of all, the first thing you notice is that Pluto has been passing up through her 10th house. So there's been this intense drive all the time when Pluto has been going through Capricorn for her to succeed on a global level. But what's happening in terms of the sun? Mercury, which is an exalted sign of Aquarius, it's brilliant. The transiting Mercury at the Super Bowl is in the 11th house. She's actually going to be having a Mercury return. She has Mercury in Aquarius natally. She's a very brilliant woman. The Sun and Saturn are all up in her 11th house, the house of community, her ability to make connections with people, her ability to be in the marketplace. And of course, this is going to be massively good for all of her brands. After all, she is an entrepreneur, besides the sales of her records, of course. And then you look at the rising. What's the rising? The rising is Aries. The rising is Aries, the area of personality. All of those planets, Venus, the moon, Juno, and Jupiter, of her planets are landing in the first house at the rising, all around the rising of the chart of the Super Bowl. She is the personality of the Super Bowl. She's the embodiment. And of course, remember, she's coming back to performing after an extended period away in order to do what? Be a mother. The moon is right there. To be a mother. Juno is right there, the wife, to fulfill that role. She's coming back after that role. And of course, this is probably the first Super Bowl we're having in which we're truly past the COVID shutdowns. So the country is coming back. She's symbolic of this new growth, this new experience. So it's pretty ideal. It's very ideal. It's very emblematic. So that's the chart. And now following this is the portrait that we did for Rihanna a while ago. It's a fascinating portrait, a fascinating person. I hope you enjoy that too. Hi, welcome to Planetary Calendars, Astro Portraits. I'm Ralph Demetrius, one of the calendar's astrologers. The portrait this week is Rihanna, and this is part of our musician series. Rihanna was born on February 20th, 1988 at 8:50 a.m. in St. Andrew, Barbados. This is a wonderful example because here's someone who's born on a Caribbean island and rises to the top of the music field. So you've got to figure there's some really special indicators in her chart, and there are. She's born at 1 degree Pisces. This is very interesting because we just were getting ready to do the chart for Olivia Rodrigo, who just won, I think, 3 Grammys recently, who's also born at the 1st degree of Pisces. So, Pisces, after all, is one of the Jupiter-ruled signs. It's a big success sign. So, people say, oh, it's controlled by Neptune. Nah, it is the feminine ruler of Jupiter. It is social, but it's responsive. She has Aries rising, which if you look at her, you can practically see that she's Aries rising. She gets glints of red off of her aura. And she has the moon in Aries just above the horizon. And not only that, the moon is part of a whole cluster. It's the moon at 11 degrees, Venus at 12 degrees, and Jupiter at 26 degrees. So they bracket the rising. The rising's 15 degrees. This puts the moon and Venus in what's called the Gogolon spot, that spot right above the horizon, where there's a tremendous amount of energy. Now, remember, we use whole sign houses. We do not use Placidus. So the house is the whole sign. So the ascendant can show up any place within that sign. Just because it's above the horizon doesn't mean it's in the 12th house. I don't know why they ever came up with that in the first place, because things that are close to the horizon typically are the most powerfully angular planets. Remember, things that are at the angles, the ascendant, the descendant, the midheaven, the icy, have more leverage. So if you're saying, oh, it's above the horizon, it's in the 12th house, the 12th house is about, energy dissolving. Well, that really doesn't describe a very angular planet. And this moon and Venus are very angular. Juno is also there, which is one of the larger asteroids. It's close to the moon. It always makes her seem very marriageable. But the Aries rising, this is Venus in Aries. This is, it's a detriment position, but it's very personal. But the moon and Aries, these are not very feminine positions for these two very feminine planets, but to give her tremendous drive. This is a person between that and the Jupiter who's not afraid to walk into new situations. It's very martial. It's a very martial position. And her Jupiter at 26 degrees Aries is trine within 2 degrees of her Mars in the 9th house in Sagittarius. So fire to fire. Mars-Jupiter trines are very powerful because it tends to give people a great deal of physical energy. They also say that it's very good for how it manages finances, that you're always able to find, when you need finances and resources to show up, they kind of show up. And it's simply because your physical actions, the martial energy, has the access to the Jupiter's long-range planning. It's always looking ahead. It's always saying, well, where are we going to go from here? Okay, so let's go in that direction. And then Mars goes there and says, oh, look, there's the stuff that we wanted to find. And sometimes not conscious of the fact that Jupiter said, go there, okay, because that's where the good stuff is. And that's that Jupiter trine. Because it's going from the 1st house to the 9th house, it's a bit of reversal. Because Mars is strongest in the 1st house and Jupiter's strongest in the 9th house. It's a little flip, but it adds that, it's got that zing. Speaking of zing, where do we look for zing in a chart? Uranus. Uranus adds electricity. And with people who become very famous, you always look for where's Uranus. Oftentimes with actors, it's at the rising. We just did the chart of Adriana Grande, a very famous singer. It's right at the rising with her. Or it's at the on the moon, or it's it might be at the midheaven. With her, it's within a cluster of planets at 0 degrees Capricorn, so it's very angular. Those angular signs, Capricorn, Cancer, Libra, Aries, when they're right at 1 degree, very early in the sign, they're very powerful. She has her Saturn in Capricorn, the feminine ruling sign, right, conjunct within the same degree with Uranus. 0 degrees Capricorn. So Uranus and Saturn are conjunct, right? So it adds real sizzle to her career. They're in the 10th house, Saturn's favorite house, especially when it's in Capricorn, favorite house. But it gets better than that, because to one side, 2 degrees away out of sign, admittedly, is the Mars at 28 degrees Sag. And Mars likes being in fire signs, but it's got the advantage of, Uranus adding sizzle and electricity. The other direction at 9 degrees is Neptune, another big success planet that adds imagination. And at 11 degrees is the midheaven. So this was a person who from very early on was focused on having a career. And she wanted an exciting career, Uranus. She wanted a truly successful career that changed her reputation, Saturn. And she wanted a career that was probably in related to imagination or the arts, that's Neptune. And what's interesting is beyond that, and these planets are up in what's called the Gogolon spot of the midheaven, up to the right of the midheaven. Okay, very much like she has the Venus and the Moon and the Gogolon spot, places where it has even more leverage. You have the Saturn, Uranus, Mars, Neptune are all in that very active range, so tremendous amounts of leverage. On the other side, she has Pallas Athena in Capricorn, showing a high skill level. So it's got very high skill levels in terms of how to build things long term, because that's what Capricorn's all about. How are we going to build things long term? From the physical body, Saturn relates to, and Capricorn relates to the physical bones, which, grow slowly. Where most tissue turns over very quickly, the bones grow very slowly. They change the cells out very slowly. Now, in the 11th house, the area where she's related to community, she has Mercury in Aquarius, the exalted sign, retrograde. I always say people with Mercury in Aquarius tend to get ideas out of the blue. They just like lightning bolts land in their head. When it's retrograde, she internalizes them. Ceres is there as well, and Ceres is about how we manage people. So she's got really good management skills. She's really good at like networking with people. She's really good at reaching out to people, which in business is tremendously important. The sun in the 12th house is really interesting because many times performers or people who work in the studio a lot or work in theater or in movies have really busy 12th houses because the 12th house is the house of imagination. She's got the sun in the 12th house in Pisces' own house, Jupiter's house, right? So, Jupiter is important, right? And Jupiter's right there about the rising in Aries, which means projecting the individual. It's Rihanna. There's not even a mention of a last name. It's Rihanna. It's not Rihanna and her band. It's Rihanna. It's her projection of her personality in a very martial way because it's Aries. But it's in the 12th house, which means that in the studio, on the movie set, in these locations, she's very comfortable. This is her natural area. What's interesting is she comes from, the Caribbean. The 12th house has to do with the ocean. So she comes from, an ocean culture. She also has Selena. I don't usually use the point there, except that in this case, it's conjunct the North Node, which means that within the studio, within this protected space, she has a tremendous charm. Selena's a very charming position. It's at the North Node, and it's something that gives her great satisfaction. Great satisfaction. Something that she has when you look at the South Node is what she brought in with her. It's in Virgo in the 6th house. She probably brought in a lot of understanding about how people heal and how to deal with your own personal health. So she's probably very good at that. Interesting, in the 4th house, she has Vesta. Vesta relates a lot to our heritage, to our grandparents. It's in the 4th house, the area of home, in Cancer. There's things about her mother, her grandmother, her lineage that's very important to her. And interesting, she has the part of fortune, finally, in the 2nd house, the house of music. She is, after all, a singer. She's a musician. In Taurus, the sign of music in the 2nd house. It's interesting because 25 degrees, Taurus is a very complex, very feminine part of Taurus. It's where Algol is. It's 3 degrees away from the Pleiades. So it's a deep, deep place. So down in this lower section, we're talking about a tremendous, kind of a well of deep femininity at the core of her personality that is not really shown when she projects through this very martial rising, all this stuff in Aries, but it's Aries with the moon and Venus there. It's a fantastic mix of masculine and feminine. Moon and Venus, but in masculine signs. Jupiter, but in masculine signs. A feminine, sun in the 12th house, but a masculine Mercury. And then feminine all at the midheaven, but it's masculine planets. Mars is we think of as a masculine planet. It's not really. But Mars and Saturn, Neptune and Uranus at the midheaven, but primarily in feminine signs. It's a deeply feminine personality, and yet it projects out through this Aries rising. It's fiercely feminine in many ways. It's a fascinating chart and very creative. She has, among other things, one final point, a quintile, 72 degrees between her Jupiter and her Mercury. Jupiter at the rising, this great creativity, this kind of emerging creativity at the rising, to Mercury in Aquarius, brilliance. Brilliance within her group. Fascinating, very fascinating. And after all, 72 degrees is one of the most feminine of the aspects. So that's the chart of Rihanna. Really fascinating part of our musician series. You find those at Planetary Calendar Astrology on YouTube. Please subscribe. And you can also go to planetarycalendar.com where you can find the planetary calendar and lots of other interesting things and books. So until next time, be well.